Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 5500 watt Briggs & Stratton storm responder generator. This machine looks to be in great shape. It's very clean, rust free, and appears to be complete. I don't see any missing parts, no physical damage, at least on the outside. But we do have a problem. The engine, it's not stuck, but it actually rotates a little bit too easily. I do not hear that piston going up and down. I do not feel any compression. So if I had to guess, this machine was run out of oil. Likely that connecting rod seized to the crankshaft and shattered into a million pieces. So this engine, it may not run again, but the goal today is to get this machine back up and running and making power again. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. All right, first things first here. I'm just going to pull the drain bolt. I want to see if we have any oil in this engine, which if we do, I'm guessing it's going to be very dark and not much of it. Yeah, there was actually more oil in there than I thought there would be. Usually they don't blow until there's just a few milliliters left. So potentially this was run on a hill. But let's measure it out and just see how short we were. Yeah, we're definitely on the low side, about 12 fluid ounces, just over 300 milliliters. And I'm actually surprised the engine blew. I mean, this should have been enough oil to keep it going for a little bit longer. So if I had to guess, I would say likely this was on a slight hill, which didn't help the situation. Anyway, let's get the borescope. I'm going to take a quick peek in there and just confirm the diagnosis of a shattered connecting rod. All right, let's take a peek and see what we see. And so far, I was going to say so far I'm not seeing anything, but if you look on the right side of your screen, I do believe that is a chunk of connecting rod. So let me actually back out. I'm going to switch to the side camera, and that might give us a little bit better view of the situation. So we'll aim the side camera kind of down, since that's where the chunks are. Yeah, that does look like a cross-section of the connecting rod. Definitely doesn't belong in the sump. Let me pan around. Maybe we can get a look at the bottom of the cylinder if we're lucky. And no, I can't see the bottom of the cylinder, but I can see the main journal there on the crankshaft, kind of on the top right of your screen. And there is no connecting rod attached. So yeah, this engine, it's no good. So yeah, it's confirmed this engine is blown and potentially could be rebuilt. I guess we'll take a closer look at it once we get it opened up. But I'm thinking for now, I'm probably going to use an engine that I've already rebuilt. I've got several of these ready to go, And the last one we rebuilt is actually right here. This one came on a Briggs Elite given to the channel by Eric. And what we found was that the engine was stuck due to rust in the cylinder, and the lifters were also rusted in place. So, as bad as that was, we did get this engine running without doing any machine work on it. And it actually ran pretty well, which was surprising because there was a lot of pitting in the bore. So I made the decision to get this rebuilt properly and machined to 20 thousandths over. And another subscriber, Ron, offered up his machine shop and performed the necessary machine work on this engine. So this is fully rebuilt and better than new. Not to mention, this is actually a better engine. This is 6 years older. It has the oil sensor, and the cylinder is a steel sleeve, whereas the one on this machine, it is just an aluminum bore. So what we need to do is free the engine from the generator so we can do the swap. So I'm going to start by getting the tank out of the way. That'll give us some better access. And then we need to remove the generator so that we can get this bad engine off the frame. So I'm just noticing a few things here when going around the machine that are disconnected. So this is the kill wire for the ignition. It should be connected to the switch. The tank vent disconnected from the airbox. Fuel line disconnected from the carburetor. And probably the most odd thing is the ignition coil. It's actually sitting here on top of the valve cover. And the spark plug is nowhere to be found. So yeah, someone went through this trying to figure it out, probably hoping it was an easy fix. And once they realized the problem, they sent it down the road. All right, so we actually need to get this control panel out of the way. It's pretty close to the top of the stator, and that's going to create an issue when trying to slide that stator out of place. So it's a lot easier to just get this out of the way. All right, everything looks to be in order. And I assume the generator is good, since someone was using it when the engine blew up. So we've got the AVR and the brushes out of the way. And you can tell by looking at the brushes, this had some use. Brushes do last a very long time. I'd say over 1,000 hours. And this definitely has a few hundred hours of wear on it. Yeah, and this is kind of an interesting example of wiring colors that don't make a lot of sense. So these wires in the front, these are the ones going to the control panel. We have blue connected to red, red connected to blue. Looks like a black to a black. And the last one looks like gray to white. So yeah, definitely take note of that. because that is not very intuitive. But in this case, we can actually leave all these wires connected because we are unplugged from the control panel. So we don't need to separate the wires from the control panel. But we do need to get the block loose so that we can get a puller in here to pull the stator off from the ball bearing. And that should be good. We don't need to disconnect anything else down here, as far as the electrical goes. So let's get these mounts disconnected. We need to remove the ground wire. And then at that point, we should be free to, pull these 4 bolts holding the stator to the bell housing and slide the stator off the engine. And this stator, it's a little bit challenging to get off because the clearance between the top of the stator and the bottom of the frame is pretty small, maybe about a ½ an inch. So what I'm going to do is actually raise this up. We'll get the feet removed, and that'll give us another 3/4 of an inch or so. And hopefully that'll give us enough room. Ideally the stator won't be resting on this bottom rail. And that way we can slide it out without too much resistance. Sometimes you can just pull the stators out without any tools, but this one, it's going to need a puller. All right, so we'll just get the puller in. And you want to be sure you don't pull on the side where the brushes were, because that is the weakest side. And really this whole housing's pretty weak. So when you apply pressure, if it starts building pressure, you need to stop, because if you keep going, it won't take much to crack the end housing. And in this case, I can see that the stator is releasing. All right, now for the challenging part, getting the rotor off. This is a tapered fit, and on this engine, the rotor bolt, the diameter is very thin. So, what I like to do usually is just unscrew this and then drive it back in most of the way, hit it a few times with a 3-pound hammer, and usually the shock will pop it right off the tapered shaft. But this bolt, it pretzels and bends very easily. So we're only going to get a couple hits. And if it doesn't come off, we're going to have to come up with a better plan. And I'm just making it a little bit loose. Maybe half a turn. Any more, and if it does start to pretzel and you give it too much to pretzel in that shaft, you might get the bolt stuck. So only half a turn, maybe a turn out. So if the bolt does bend, hopefully it doesn't get stuck in the rotor shaft. I think that might have done it. And the last thing we need to pull off here is this bell housing. So we're going to have to transfer this to the rebuilt engine. So just 4 bolts holding it in place. This one does have some lock washers. So these might come out without too much issue. But a lot of times they do put Loctite. So if they don't come out easy, we might have to apply some heat before the Loctite will release. Before I secure this side of the engine, I'm actually going to pull the exhaust off. This exhaust, it works fine. But the one on the blown up engine is a little bit cleaner, a little bit less rust. So we'll put the better part on the machine that works. All right, so we'll get this exhaust installed. Not quite as new as I was hoping, but it's definitely better than what was on here. So I think before we get this generator installed, let's just test it real quick, make sure it's good. Theoretically it should be, but you never know. So I'm going to use this milliohm meter to test the resistance and also check for ground faults. If you don't have something like this, you can use a regular multimeter, but some of them will struggle testing some of the low values that we see on the stator. So just keep that in mind. So checking the rotor, usually I see between 40 and 70 ohms on a healthy rotor. And this one is at 61. I saw there for a second. Yep, 61 ohms. So that is good. Let's just check it to ground. No ground fault. So the rotor seems to be good. So let's get this out of the way and test the stator. And for the stator, it's going to be a very similar test. We want to make sure that the resistance is within spec, that we don't have any ground faults, and that no winding is shorted to the other. So we're going to start with leg 1. This is one of the main outputs, and usually around 0.3 ohms is what I'd see on a healthy stator. And yeah, we're at 0.32 or 0.31, so that seems good. No fault to ground. Let's check leg 2. And if you don't know what these readings should be, they should be about the same between leg 1 and leg 2. So we're looking for 0.32. And yeah, 0.31, 0.32, so we're in that range. So leg 2 seems to be good. No fault to ground, so leg 1 and leg 2 appear to be good. Over here, we do have a connector that plugs into the AVR. The green and the white, that just connects to leg 1, leg 2. That is the sense winding. That's how the AVR adjusts the voltage. And the blue wires, those are the power or the DPE winding going into the AVR. So that's ultimately what gets rectified and sent to the brushes. So let's check that. Usually should be between 1.5 and 2.5 ohms. And we're at 1.64, so that is perfect. We'll check it to ground, no fault to ground. And there should not be any connection to leg 1 or leg 2. And there's not. So the DPE winding is good. And I guess we can also just check between leg 1 and leg 2. There should be no connection because we're fully isolated, and there's not. The sense winding, the white and the green, there will be a connection because this is essentially a tap into the main output so the AVR can monitor what's going on. Yeah, and there's the connection over. Let's try the white wire. We should see the same. Yeah, and we do. So the stator and the rotor appear to be in good health. And before we get this installed, I do want to clean the brushes. I'm actually going to do that once the rotor's back on the crankshafts. But the other thing is that, this bolt, it is a smaller diameter bolt than some. But the rotor shaft, it can accommodate the larger bolt. So if we had the larger bolt in there, which this crankshaft can't use, that bolt is pretty much self-centering. It can't go anywhere. But because we have the smaller diameter bolt, it fits pretty loose in there. And when you tighten it up, usually the bolt goes to one side or the other. And, the manufacturers don't seem to care. But if you torque this and the bolt is sideways to 18 foot-pounds, and then at some point it straightens out, you now have a lot less torque on this bolt, and potentially it could spin out. So what I like to do is just build up a shoulder with some electrical tape to center that bolt, or at least help get it more true to where it should be. So I'm going to do that now, and then we'll get the rotor back on the engine. And usually I do overshoot just a bit, which is fine. We'll just peel off the extra, make it a snug fit, but not too snug. So yeah, we've overshot just a little bit. So I'll pull one turn out, see if that fixes that issue. Oh, still tight. Perfect. So we'll get these bolts torqued properly, and then we need to spin the engine over. I want to make sure that the alignment between the stator and the rotor is good. You know, the engine should rotate freely with no binding. And sometimes when you put the stator and the rotor together, you know, the alignment's just a little bit off. And that can have some pretty serious consequences as far as, you know, how long your generator's going to last. So I just torqued these to 40 inch-pounds. I'm going to bring it up now to 100. And then we'll turn the engine over, see how it sounds. So I'm going to rotate the engine slowly to start with. The spark plugs are moved, so there's no compression. But there is some resistance. The valve springs pushing against the cam. You know, you will feel a little something, but what you don't want to see or hear is any noise down here. And in this case, I think we're good. So we are getting pretty close here. You know, once we have the brushes and the AVR connected and the control panel, I think we'll be good to fire this up and see what the power output is. Now, this engine, it is freshly rebuilt. I don't have a lot of hours on it. In fact, it's probably only been running for a few minutes. So, you know, likely we should break this in before putting it under any kind of a heavy load. I guess the other thing of concern here too is that this engine technically is slightly smaller. Now, the engine that was on here, you know, this generator was rated at 5,500 watts, and this slightly smaller engine was on a generator rated at 5,600 watts. So, yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that, because usually this engine I find on generators only rated at 5,000 watts. So we might potentially fall a few hundred watts short. But we won't know that, you know, until we break the engine in and put it to the test. All right, let's give this a try. We're plugged into external fuel. Fuel valve's on, the choke's on, ignition's on. We also have a light plugged in and turned on, and a kilowatt, so we can see what the power output is. So let's see if this was worth all the effort. All right, very nice. The engine started first pull, could turn the choke off right away, and the engine ran quite well. It sounds nice and healthy, not to mention the generator is making power. So everything critical that needs to work is working. We now have a viable machine. That said, though, we do need to make some adjustments to the engine speed and potentially the voltage. We were at about 52 hertz, 113 volts. So I think if we move the spring back to where it should be, that's going to bring us pretty close to 61.5 hertz and likely bring the voltage up as well. But I don't want to move it yet. I actually put it like this on purpose after the rebuild. I want to run the engine at a reduced speed for a couple hours until the engine is fully broken in. We'll then change the oil, set the engine speed to 61.5 hertz, and then we can put this to the test and see just how well it does under load. So for now, I am going to leave the end cover off until we get the engine speed up to where it should be. I'm not sure if we need to adjust that voltage or not, but we can add the tank. And at that point, I'm going to shift focus. We'll open up the blown engine and see just how bad it is. All right, I'm going to start by tearing down the front, starting with the airbox. The rebuilt engine is actually missing its airbox, so we can use this one on the good engine. Well, I think I found the smoking gun as far as what did this engine in. Initially, I thought it was due to low oil. That's usually how these engines die. So I pulled the drain plug and was surprised. Although the oil was low, it wasn't critically low. So I wasn't completely sold on that idea. But after removing the airbox, I was preparing to remove the carburetor, and I happened to grab the governor arm and found that it didn't move. And that's because the throttle plate on the carburetor, it is locked up solid in the wide open throttle position. So like this, the governor would not be able to slow the engine speed down. And if somebody started it in this condition, the engine would have sped out of control. And if not shut down in time, it would absolutely throw a rod. So likely that is what happened to this engine. And most generators, the resting position is wide open throttle. So whenever I get something new, I always check that the plate moves before trying to start it, because if they left the fuel valve on a gravity-fed system and the needle wasn't sealing perfectly, that fuel would slowly seep past the needle and seat and kind of puddle around both the choke plate and the throttle plate. And if given enough time, it will cause it to lock up like we're seeing here. And I think you can just see it right there at the bottom, actually, of the throttle shaft. There is a bunch of rust and corrosion, and that is what is holding the throttle plate in position. So, likely this can be freed up and used at some point on a different machine. There we go, fixed. So that maybe 30 seconds of work would have saved this engine from destruction. Okay, good. We can get in there, I think, without pulling the rockers off. So we got a head bolt there, two right there. And these two are kind of under this tin. So let's get those two bolts out, get this tin out of the way, then we can pull the head off. Well, the valves, they don't look terrible. I was kind of worried that the piston may have struck the valves and bent them. But if they did, there is nothing obvious. There's no marks on the piston from the valves. But we will test that in a minute, see if they are bent or straight. As far as the piston goes, at least from the top, it looks good. And from what I can see on the cylinder, it's not terrible, although there are some marks down here, but they can't be felt. And some more marks on the top, but pretty much the same thing. They don't catch when I run my finger over them. And the piston, it does move, but not when the engine is rotated. So, yeah, let's get the flywheel off. Then we can get the engine opened up and see just how bad it is. I'm going to sand this very lightly. there's a bit of rust there, and that's going to prevent the crankshaft from coming out. And actually, this side's a lot worse, so we have to do the same here as well. I think there's thread locker on these bolts, so I'm going to apply some heat that should help loosen them up. Then we'll try the impact again. And that's one of the chunks there from the big end of the rod. It actually split right in the center, which is interesting. I haven't seen that before. Here is one of the sides. Dipper is actually intact. That's what flings the oil around. And we have a third piece. So that's pretty much it in the bottom here. So I'm going to rotate this just, I was going to say line up the timing marks, although it doesn't really matter since we've taken the head off. There's no spring tension on the valves. Camshaft looks decent. Lobes are good. And the compression release is intact, so that appears to be good. Lifters look good. And let's get the crankshaft out. And we'll get the piston out as well. I think the piston is damaged. It's not coming out easily. Yeah, overall, there is damage, but it could be a lot worse. The crankshaft, the journals on the outside here are in perfect condition. The one for the connecting rod, not in great shape. There is a lot of aluminum transfer, which likely can be cleaned off. So there's a chance that that is a usable part. The piston actually doesn't look bad. Some minor scoring on the skirts. But I think the piston is usable. Now, it was kind of hard to get out of the cylinder, and I think that is just due to some buildup here on the top. So likely we don't have an issue there. Now, the bore, it is more damaged than I thought. These lines on the bottom, they're actually pretty deep and can be felt. And on the top, there is a lot of discoloration, but actually that, I think, is just superficial. That would hone out, but the stuff on the bottom, I don't think it would. And this is actually an aluminum bore, so honing it may not be a good idea either. I have honed these in the past because the service manual said you could. But as I found out recently, the older series of these engines, they have a steel sleeve, and the newer ones do not. And the service manual does not differentiate between the two. So I don't know for sure if we can hone this out. We might just end up scraping off the nickel cell. And even if that wasn't an issue, we do have a big chunk right on the top here missing from the bottom of the bore. And those parts, you can actually see them kind of in the deep end of the oil. So yeah, block, not in great shape. Obviously the connecting rod is junk. Camshaft is good. End cover and governor seem to be fine. And the cylinder head actually is in good shape. I put some fuel in here actually a few minutes ago, and we do not have any leaks on either port. So I don't think the valves hit the piston. So the head is likely good. So I'm going to leave the plastic cover off for now on this engine. That's going to block access to the governor spring. And until we get this engine running at the right speed, we need access to this. So before getting the airbox on, I actually want to swap out the blower housing. I do have one that is more appropriate for a storm responder and in better condition. So the big question is, will this fit? This is actually from the next size up engine, but I'm fairly certain most of these parts are interchangeable. All right, so let's get the engine started. I want to break this engine in properly, but the break-in should be pretty quick on this given that it was machined properly at a machine shop. So the plan is, just to get the engine started, I'm going to run it at the reduced speed for about an hour with a 1500 watt load. We'll change the oil, get it restarted, adjust the speed to where it should be, and run it likely for another hour to complete the break-in process. Well, it's been an hour and 15 minutes. No issues at all. The engine sounds nice and healthy. So I'm going to take the load off. We'll give it a minute to cool down, and then we'll shut it down. So it'll be interesting to see what this oil looks like. Usually after a rebuild, the first oil change, the oil doesn't look great. And I might have to get a different tool for this. The wheel is kind of preventing a straight shot here. Wow, that is on there tight. There we go. And it's going to make a mess. The frame rail is kind of in the way here. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to tell with all the glare on the video, but the oil looks pretty good. There is a slight bit of gray metallic in there, but that is typical on break-in oil. That should clean up with another oil change or two. So, we are refilled with oil. I'm going to get that governor spring back in the right spot. We'll get it running again for another hour or so. All right, so this governor spring, it should be one position further out. At least that's where it was, in the number 7 position. So I haven't bent this tab at all during the rebuild process. So if I put it back to that position, we should be more or less back to the right speed. And if we're not, we can then always make an adjustment here on this tab to change the tension to what we need it to be. Okay, let's get it restarted. Well, we've got the right engine speed now. We're pretty much exactly at 61.5 hertz, but the voltage didn't change. And that's kind of expected with an automatic voltage regulator. Its job is to maintain the voltage steady no matter what the engine speed is. But we can adjust that using the potentiometer right here. Usually one full turn will give you 2 volts, but not always. Sometimes one full turn will give you 20. So just keep that in mind. In this case, I just gave it 3.5 turns. That should get us to 120 volts or potentially more. So I'm going to resecure this, probably just with 1 bolt for now. We'll start it real quick and just see if we overshot and potentially need to make another adjustment. All right, and that did it. We're at 120 volts, just a bit over. I mean, technically you could do this while it's running, but there is high voltage here, 240 volts. The power going to the brushes is over 100 volts, and of course we have lots of moving parts, so definitely not recommended. We just passed the 1 hour mark again, so we now have 2 hours of runtime on the rebuilt engine. So let's take the load off, and again we'll let it cool down, change the oil, and I think at that point we'll be ready for the load test. I brought both of these inside just so you could get a better look at them. And without telling you which is which, I think you can probably guess. The oil we just drained from the machine looks basically like new. And this is the first oil change right here. So both of these have about the same amount of runtime on it. They were the same oils, the same weights, probably from the same bottle, but you can see the difference here. So it is important to break in an engine and change the oil several times until it cleans up like we have now. So we can get this closed up now. We just need to zip tie these wires kind of out of the way from getting wrapped around the rotor. So we'll use one of these zip ties that you can bolt right there. And let's get the switch connected back to that plastic piece that goes on the top. So the kill wire goes in the middle, ground toward the inside. So we're all connected and ready to go here. The big question is, will this pull its rated load of 5,500 watts? And of that, I seriously doubt. Now, on the surface, you would think it should. You know, this engine, according to the machine or the engine cover that was originally on it, it's rated at 10 horsepower. And the original Storm Responder engine was also rated at 10 horsepower. So these should be a perfect match, and we should have no problem. The issue is, this is a smaller engine by 1 horsepower. Because it's an older engine, Briggs actually labeled it 10 horsepower, and then after a 2010 class action, this became a 9-horse engine, whereas the engine that was on here used to be an 11-horse, and then they downgraded it to 11. So no matter how you look at it, this is a smaller engine and is less capable. Now, the engine came off a generator originally that was rated at 5,560 watts. So again, you would think, all right, this engine should be able to do it, but that generator didn't have an AVR. So under a 5,500 watt load, or at least what you think is a 5,500 watt load, actually isn't, because without the AVR, you get a voltage drop. And when you factor that in, the 5,500 watts that you think you're pulling, it's actually more like 4,600 watts. And this generator has an AVR, so it's going to maintain perfect voltage. And the voltage on this machine is actually a little bit over 120 volts, which isn't going to help us at all getting to the number that we want to. So yeah, I think 5,000 watts is the best we're going to see, at least on the load bank. And once you factor in the 200 watts for the cooling fans, the 100 watts for the light, you know, we'll be lucky to get 5,300 watts out of this. But of course, I'm going to go for the max and see where the breaking point is on this machine. So let's get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the kilowatt to measure the frequency in the hertz. We use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion, the oscilloscope to see what the waveform looks like, and of course the load bank to apply the load. So if everything checks out, we'll put on a half load. We'll give that a bit of time. And if everything looks good, we'll bring the load up until we reach its rated load, or we find out where it runs out of horsepower. No issues getting the engine started first pull, and it sounds really good. The engine speed's a little bit on the slow side, so we might have to keep an eye on that. That's not going to help us get to the rated power that we want. THD is starting out pretty good at 4.7%, and the sine wave looks pretty good. So let's start with a 2500 watt load. So 2000 watts. 2500 watts. We're maintaining speed at about, I would say, 59 hertz. THD jumped to 15%, and the sine wave, not as jagged, but it is a little deformed. Pretty typical though. So let's give this a few minutes, and then we'll go for the max of 5500 watts. All right, no issues at all at 2500 watts. So let's bring it up to 3000, 3500, 4000. We're at about 58 hertz, which is passable. THD is 16.5, and the sine wave looks about the same. So let's bring that up some more. We'll swap these, bring it back to 4000. Let's try 4500. Let's try 5000. Yeah, you can tell we're pretty much at the limit. So 5000 watts plus 200 for the load bank, 100 for the light. We're at 5300 watts. 16.7% THD, and sine wave's about the same. So let's give this a couple minutes, and then we'll bump it up a little bit more and see if we can get to 5500 watts of load from the load bank. All right, it's been a few minutes pulling 5000 watts. Actually 5300 when you factor everything in, and it's been holding just fine. Now the engine speed, it is slow at 56 hertz, so we could bump the no load speed up a bit. You know, it was a little bit low, so we might do that, but let's see if we can go any higher. So I'm going to swap these to put 5000 back on. Let's try 5500, and no. Definitely out of horsepower trying to do 5500 watts on the load bank. So let's take the load off. Let's double check the no load speed. We might be able to get a little bit more out of that. It was at 60.5 when the engine was cold, and now that it's warmed up, we're kind of where I like to be. Now, it's not to say you couldn't go a little higher, like 62 hertz. But in this case, you know, the engine is producing the power it's supposed to. So I don't think over-revving it is really the answer here. So I'm going to let things cool down, and then we'll shut it down. So yeah, no surprise, the 9-horse engine couldn't quite pull its rated load. That said though, we did get to 95% of its rated load, and that is a heck of a lot better than where we started with a blown engine that had no potential of pulling any load. So, at the end of the day, yes, we did lose a little bit of horsepower, but we gained a better engine. This engine is actually made a lot better than the engine that came on here. Besides the oil sensor, we do have the steel sleeve and much beefier gears. So with a little bit of care, this engine should last the life of this machine. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.